Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. A massive backflip on treaties in Queensland, with the opposition LNP pulling support for these treaties following the overwhelming rejection of the Voice on the weekend. Now, big news, it puts the whole thing in doubt. There's a caucus meeting underway. Fair amount of pressure on Anastasia Palaszczuk. I'll tell you why in a moment when I speak with David Chrisley. Farming communities angry that governments are rolling out renewable power lines with nothing more than sham consultation. A whole lot of officials walked out of a recent public meeting without answering legitimate concerns, particularly about fire risk. We'll cross to a farmer on the ground tonight. Plus, despite the Israeli Defence Force laying out their evidence to show it was likely an Islamic Jihad rocket that hit the hospital in Gaza, there's a growing cohort of Labor MPs, even members of Cabinet, that appear to be equivocating about Israel's right to go after the Hamas terrorists who unprovoked slaughtered over 1,000 innocent civilians. And opposition leader Peter Dutton has condemned the Prime Minister for failing to support the Coalition's push for a royal commission into child sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities. Also rejecting the inquiry, listen to this, crossing the floor to support Labor as well, was one of the Liberals' own, Bridget Archer.
I think she's made a mistake. It's the wrong decision, and most importantly, from my perspective, it takes away from the Prime Minister's culpability here.
I'll have something to say about Bridget Archer in a moment, but first, if it wasn't obvious already, it should be now. We live in a much more dangerous world. With Israeli forces poised to strike in Gaza in an entirely justified but exceedingly perilous bid to remove the Hamas leadership dedicated to killing Jews and destroying Israel, the Middle East is teetering on the brink of a wider war. While Ukraine seems to be making slow and costly progress in its fight to be free of the Russian invader, the Gaza crisis will inevitably distract its supporters' attention and quite possibly reduce supplies of the weapons that are enabling its advance. And then there's Beijing, intent on taking Taiwan by force if necessary, and seeking regional and eventual world domination, pondering whether now is the time to strike. So much depends upon the calibre of the American president as leader of the free world. But the kindest thing you can say about President Biden is that he's past his prime. If there were ever a time for other countries to step up, this is now. While British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has just made a memorable speech in solidarity with the people of Israel, it will take much more than words to help keep them safe. And good on Sunak for landing in Israel tonight. Here in Australia, though, a significant part of the Labor Party can't decide whose side they're on, the government and the people of Israel, or on the side of Hamas, on account of the civilian casualties inevitable in hunting down terrorists who use human shields. Now, the fickleness of support for Israel was on full display yesterday after Hamas claimed that an Israeli airstrike had destroyed a hospital and killed hundreds of civilians. It was always clear that Israel never deliberately targets civilians, unlike Hamas, which does so routinely. Even prepared to use their own people if they can cause carnage and blame it on Israel. Now, it's pretty conclusively clear that it was a defective Hamas or Islamic Jihad rocket that damaged the hospital. But that didn't stop several Middle East leaders pulling out of meetings with Biden, and it certainly hasn't stopped the anti-Israel bile from the Greens and some Labor MPs.
The Israeli military has already changed their story, firstly saying that, then saying it was Islamic Jihad, and that's been denied by Islamic Jihad. Civilian casualties is what happens when there is an unlawful invasion of 2.2 million civilians forced into such a small area.
I feel very strongly that Palestinians are being collectively punished here for Hamas's barbarism.
The people of Gaza cannot be collateral damage. There is no justification whatsoever under any rules of war or anything that will allow a civilian population to square off against an army.
But I would say, and I would urge Israel to abide by international laws on the rules of engagement. They are there for a reason.
But it's telling too, as someone involved in setting up leader-to-leader calls in the past, that Anthony Albanese is yet to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, we're told our PM has put in a request. It certainly didn't happen early on, but I suspect Labor's lukewarm support of Israel, even in the face of those atrocities committed by Hamas, is playing into how we are perceived overseas. Forget the voice referendum damaging us. Most countries would see our refusal to put race into our constitution as a good thing. But a weak position on Israel that's a real departure from where Australia has stood in the past, including Australia's pivotal role in the very creation of the State of Israel in the first place in the aftermath of the Second World War. But as much as we should be focused on the Middle East, it's closer to home that worries me, and what China is up to while Gaza plays out. I keep getting mixed signals on China from the Albanese government. Is it business as usual with China, suggested, of course, by the PM's planned trip? Or is China our great strategic adversary, as suggested by the AUKUS alliance that Labor says it supports? And if it's the latter, what are we doing about building up our military might should the worst happen in our region? Given all the talk, despite all the talk, military spending is not increasing, notwithstanding a much higher threat environment. And today we learned that our embarrassingly small armed forces are down 4,000 personnel because of recruitment and retention problems. With the government still seemingly obsessed with race relations and dividing Australians, with a treaty between ourselves, despite that comprehensive result on the weekend, when will the Prime Minister stop his fixation with issues that matter in his inner city Sydney seat and start focusing instead on where the rest of the country is at? And a little bit of time too, I might say, from the PM behind his desk and not overseas, not at a sporting match, not playing DJ at a concert on the weekend, a bit of work behind his desk, a few meetings with people that know what they're talking about, well, that might be a good start. All right, as you know, I think a lot of our state Liberal oppositions need to lift their game. But at least a couple of them have now acknowledged the referendum result, unlike the Prime Minister. Today, the Queensland opposition leader David Chrisley, who'll join me soon, withdrew his support for Queensland treaties in the wake of Saturday's emphatic vote against the Voice. Now, it was always a mistake to support treaties. With the hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation per treaty, that would inevitably mean, on top of the billions already spent every year, Queensland now can at least hold their heads up high. The Queensland LNP leader has read the room, and he knows that the referendum result changes things dramatically. Likewise too in New South Wales, Liberal leader there, Mark Speakman, he has also come out today and said he won't be pursuing treaties. Now, so far, though, there's been silence from the Victorian Liberal leader, John Pizzuto, even though Victoria's Uruk Commission, this is their treaty commission, has doubled down on the treaty process and truth-telling in the wake of the weekend's referendum rebuff. Pizzuto and the Victorian Liberals did not oppose the legislation to set up Victoria's Treaty Commission, despite the backlash from Liberal Party members. And most of the Pizzuto crowd did sweet bugger all for the campaign for no on the weekend, despite no being the agreed position of their federal counterparts. With New South Wales and Queensland showing the way, he's hoping the Victorian Liberals grow a spine. Now, I don't expect them to lead, but please, can they at least follow? All right, headlines now with Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. As the Prime Minister prepares to head to Washington next week to meet with US President Joe Biden, the opposition leader says Anthony Albanese should be heading to Israel instead.
To be able to stand with Israel at this time, as other world leaders have done. That should be the priority frankly, of any international travel at the moment.
A suggestion it seems the Prime Minister won't take up. It comes as Cabinet Minister Ed Husic claimed Palestinians are being collectively punished, while Anna Lee said Israel could be investigated for war crimes.
The number of Palestinians that have been killed so far equates to the number of people who lost their lives, 9/11. We don't see any public landmarks in Australia that are being lit up in red, black, white and green. I feel very strongly that Palestinians are being collectively punished here for Hamas's barbarism.
The ministers have stepped up their criticisms of Israel's actions. They're warning of an unfolding humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Labor backbencher Maria Van Vakanu joined in and called for Israel to halt their invasion.
The people of Gaza cannot be collateral damage. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. There is no justification whatsoever under any rules of war or anything that will allow a civilian population to square off against an army.
While their colleagues downplayed any division.
Innocent civilian life on one side of a wall is not worth any more or any less than an innocent civilian life on the other side of the wall.
The opposition leader has criticised Bridget Archer for not supporting his push for a royal commission into the sexual abuse of Indigenous children. Peter Dutton moved a motion in the House of Representatives this morning, and his MP once again crossed the floor.
Well, I can have a private conversation with Bridget. As much as I love the Ray Hadley Morning Show, I shan't discuss the private conversations on air. On this issue, though, I don't understand why Bridget crossed the floor. I think it's a very significant issue for our country, as I say. I think she's made a mistake. It's the wrong decision. And it, most importantly, from my perspective, it takes away from the Prime Minister's culpability here.
Archer, who campaigned for a yes vote in her marginal Tasmanian seat of Bass, is a survivor of child sexual abuse. We don't want to divide the country by race, yet we are singling out abuse in Indigenous communities, she told The Guardian. It's very difficult to see this motion as anything other than weaponising abuse for some perceived political advantage. The unemployment rate has dropped from 3.7% to 3.6% in September. It's the latest sign the labour market remains relatively tight, despite a dozen rate hikes since May last year. Treasurer Jim Chalmers echoed RBA Governor Michelle Bullock's concerns about the Israel-Gaza conflict and its impact on inflation.
Conflict in the Middle East is now another concerning part of the economic outlook.
Joining me now, Sky News senior reporter Carolyn Marcus and Radio 2GB host Michael McLaren. Thank you both for your time. Let's start, if we can, please. In this real sense, there's a weakening of Labor's support for Israel as Israel gets set to take on, of course, the Hamas terror regime. We've got 100 of the unions, Australian unions, lending their support to back Palestine against Israel. We've got those front benches. We just saw those comments now. Ed Husic and Ali, both in Cabinet in Canberra, saying that Israel could be investigated for alleged war crimes. We have the two Teals earlier in the week joining with the Greens to condemn Israel and also invoke the language of war crimes. And Michael, we're not even 2 weeks out from that horrific day of tragedy in Israel's south. Labor appears to be going soft, the hard left that now controls the Labor leadership, including the Prime Minister, I have to say. It looks to me like they are asserting themselves.
Yes, I think that's a very good assessment, Peter. And as for that union letter signed by 100 delegates or whoever they were, I mean, the union movement have to have a good hard look at themselves here. They've backed the yes case, despite, I would assume, a lot of their members wanting absolutely no union intervention whatsoever, and they've obviously been on the wrong side of that. They're now getting involved in this. I mean, if I was a lowly paid healthcare worker or someone cleaning the bathrooms in a hospital as part of the health services union, or this is not where I want my hard-earned dues going. I want the union fighting for pay rises for me and better conditions for me, not getting involved in international political stories which, let's be blunt, won't be solved anytime soon, even at the highest diplomatic levels. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So the unions have to pull their head in, as do some of these other MPs. I mean, talking of war crimes and the like, it's something that is being said very easily, shall we say, from, thank God, peaceful, safe Australia, for the time being anyway. If the shoe was on the other foot and we were the ones, our communities, even these MPs' communities being attacked by a terrorist organisation and thousands of people losing their lives in the most horrific circumstances in their homes, I don't think, should the Australian government decide to retaliate, they'd be using the same language.
And of course, Caroline, you were at the coalface today. You were at an event with the Jewish community campaigning for hostages taken by Hamas to be released. Incredibly emotional scenes. Have a listen.
To the media and politicians, there should be one question out there to Hamas. When are you going to release our hostages, our families, our children, our sons, our daughters, our grandparents?
Yeah, this is not an academic question for a lot of these people, Jewish community people in Australia, because they have close family and friends in Israel impacted.
It's a topic that still beggars belief for me that we don't have universal recognition that these hostages should be released, but instead the focus seems to have moved very quickly, and not just on the Greens, but now in government today as well, hearing from these ministers, onto the suffering of the Palestinians people. And of course there should be focus on any innocent civilian lives that are lost, but so quickly have they forgotten about these 200 hostages that were brutally taken from their homes, from peace festivals, and held by Hamas in Gaza. And where is the condemnation of Hamas for what they've done from these so-called human rights organisations, from the Greens, from these Labor ministers who are talking about alleged war crimes? We hear very little from these same people about that. And I have to say, as a member of the Jewish community, the community is not feeling safe. We're hearing all the time reports of threats, allegations that are being made of alleged crimes against Jews. I covered a couple of cases last week where one man had allegedly threatened 4 teenage boys who were displaying the Israel flag. Another where 3 men stood outside the Jewish museum where Holocaust survivors still volunteer and displayed a Nazi salute, allegedly, and they're going to face court over that. And of course in Melbourne we saw people openly parading on public transport doing the Nazi salute on the streets of Melbourne. We very much don't feel safe. And I broke the news today, Peter, that on those repatriation flights from Israel, the Australian Federal Police actually put air marshals on those planes because clearly there is a threat to Israelis and Australian Israelis returning from those countries in terms of security. Now, that was a program that was scaled back, but obviously there was enough of a risk for them to feel that they needed to put those air marshals, those plainclothes armed officers on planes. So it is a very real threat for the community. And I think in all this rush to see both sides of the issue, we are forgetting how this started and the atrocity that started it and why Israel needs to defend itself.
Yeah, and there's what's missing in some of the language about, we heard it there from Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, innocent civilians on either side of the line. There is a big difference between retaliation and unprovoked attack, and that's where we started, as I said, less than 2 weeks ago now in southern Israel. What do you make of the Tasmanian Liberal Bridget Archer on the issue of the Royal Commission into child sex abuse in Aboriginal communities, rejected in the Senate, pushed very hard again today in the House by Peter Dutton? He tried to suspend standing orders to bring on the motion, obviously didn't succeed. The government's got the numbers in the lower house. But in and around that's some really powerful language. He's a former detective. He's worked on issues of child sexual abuse. He feels very passionately about this. But I tell you, for what I am told is the 27th time Bridget Archer crosses the floor to sit with Labor. Now, Michael, how on earth you vote against an inquiry into child sexual abuse anyway is beyond me, but she's supposed to be a Liberal.
Yes, I know. And she also, of course, voted essentially in favour of The Voice, despite the party's position on that. Now, the Liberal Party's a broad church, as you know, Peter. People can wander across to the other side.
Not that broad, mate. Not that broad.
It certainly shouldn't be a habit. And Bridget Archer seems to be more in the more honoured in the breach than the observance of party unity on some of these matters. Now, look, she might have personal reasons why she voted this way on this issue, but to me, as you say, it seems strange to sort of stake your claim on this one. The average Australian, I think, having heard the stories that have been told of sexual abuse of Indigenous people in communities now for decades, have said, we've got to do something about this. And the no vote on the weekend wasn't to say just forget Indigenous affairs and just carry on. It was saying no to that particular proposal. But I think everybody around the table says we've got to do something to improve the lives, particularly of women and children. And, of course, you're not going to close the gap on any measurement if you are living in a community where this heinous activity is rife. So something clearly has to be done, and a Royal Commission can shine a light.
And her seat voted 77% no. I mean, Carolyn Marcus, she should be honourable and she should quit the Liberal Party, sit on the crossbench if that's her bag. But I tell you, Liberals would be crazy to give her pre-selection again.
Well, next time she crosses the floor, Peter, and there will be a next time, given her track record, she should just stay there because she's clearly in the wrong party. I mean, we know that the Liberal Party has a position where you can vote against the party. The Labor Party doesn't have that. And it's good. We have Liberal values. There are Liberal values in the Liberal Party, but this is taking the piss. If she's crossed the floor 27 times, if that's accurate, and she's crossed on housing, emissions reduction, the censure motion against the PM, she not only supported The Voice, she stood next to the Prime Minister campaigning for it in Tasmania. She's clearly not a Liberal. But also on the point of the Royal Commission, I mean, I think it's disingenuous for everyone who supported The Voice because they said they wanted to make a tangible difference to the lives of Indigenous people. Surely there is no more important issue today than the safety of children in these communities, which are being abused at rates much higher than the general population. That should be priority number one. And if they thought The Voice was going to fix that and that didn't get up, then at least try something to look at what might be the real solutions here.
All right, Carolyn Michael, thank you. Now I want to pick up some good news. This morning, Queensland opposition leader David Chrisley announced his party no longer supports the Labor government's proposed treaty laws, saying that the path to treaty will only create further division. It appears Chrisley, unlike those in the Albanese government and state Labor governments around the country, has read the room after Saturday's historic result. Here's what the Premier had to say today.
Well, I think you need to speak to him to hear firsthand why he is going against what he said very clearly in the Parliament he was going to do. Well, the next stage is truth-telling, and that's a 3 to 4 year process, and that's something that was voted on a bipartisan manner in the Queensland Parliament. And I urge you to go and look at all of the statements and the comments that were made in the speeches up in Cairns.
Joining me now, David Chrisley himself from Queensland. David, we'll get to the Premier in a moment, but tell us why the LNP that you lead can no longer support a treaty.
Peter, because when Queenslanders speak, leaders should listen, and Queenslanders spoke, and I can tell you I heard them. Now, what I don't want to do, having reflected on what's happened and having seen what I think would probably be the most divisive debate I've ever seen in my time in public life, I just don't want to put my state through what I have seen the nation put through. Now, you mentioned the Albanese government. The Prime Minister was warned on multiple occasions in the last 6 months that if he continued down this path, this is what would occur. This is the kind of division that would occur. Well, I'm not going to make the same mistake as the Prime Minister. And right now, Queenslanders need to make sure that they understand we are serious about uniting the country. I am serious about delivering infrastructure for Indigenous communities. It has to be done with everybody united and focused, and that's why I've listened to the message.
I just want to say to David, as we go to air, there's late breaking news that there has been called in Queensland a snap meeting of the Labor caucus. I'm told the left faction are furious that she appears to be walking back the treaty commitment. Of course, she's trying to make the issue about you, but the factions have dragged her in. It's interesting, 7 out of 10 Queenslanders on Saturday night rejected the voice. Who runs the state up there? Is it the Premier or the factions?
I think you know the answer to that, and so do Queenslanders. It is a government driven by factions. What I want to do is say to Queenslanders that my priorities are Queenslanders' priorities. And what I want to do is focus on the things that Queenslanders are telling me about. And first and foremost is they want to see us united, not divided. And that's why I've taken this stance, having listened really, really carefully and reflecting those views. I also want Queenslanders to know that my laser-like focus won't change. I want to see an end to the youth crime crisis. I want to see an end to the housing crisis, the health crisis and the cost of living crisis. All of those things are magnified here in Queensland because the government has been so racked with chaos and crisis, because there is the infighting, because there is that factional warlords. And what's going on in the caucus of the Labor Party has no interest for me. I want Queenslanders to know that my focus is on the things that matter to them and their families, and their priorities are my priorities.
In Canberra, Jacinta Price has called for a royal commission into child sexual abuse in remote Indigenous communities. Queensland, of course, has a number of those communities. Do you support a royal commission?
Peter, I think you have to look at Jacinta, and in her you see someone who is fair income. And when she's speaking about that, she's talking about it from lived experience, and she's talking about it from someone who really cares about doing something for those Indigenous communities. And I put Peter Dutton in the same camp, someone who is a person of great morals. So when they say something like that, I listen. Now, the things that I control are where the money from Queensland is being spent in those communities. And I know a lot of money is spent at the moment in Indigenous communities, but there hasn't been a lot of review about the value that those communities are getting. Now, part of this process I want to do is shine a light on the dysfunctionality and the fact that in many cases we are seeing housing rates go backwards, education rates go backwards, home ownership isn't an option, and we've got to get fair income about this. So my focus is on no division, and this process would have delivered that. So we're being really, really firm and saying we're not going to make the same mistake as Mr Albanese. But I can tell you something, we are not going to allow the unfettered expenditure from other groups that are coming into these communities and not delivering for the people on the ground. And I think that's what would unite all Queenslanders and all Australians to know that we are fair income about doing something in these remote communities.
Well, I think you're on the side of 70% of Queenslanders walking away from that treaty process. Let's see what the factions tell the Premier to do when that meeting breaks up tonight. David Chrisley, thank you.
Thanks for your time, Peter.
All right, coming up, we'll talk to a top security expert to get the latest from the ground in Israel as tensions reach boiling point after that Gaza hospital explosion. Plus, we'll talk to a farmer about why Victorians are up in arms about the government's failure to take into account the fire risks associated with all of this new green energy transmission lines. Well, coming up, wait until you hear how much members of the South Australian Voice to the Parliament will be paid by taxpayers. But first, let's return to Israel, where the situation is continuing to develop. Yesterday, the devastating blast that tore through the hospital in Gaza City, killing hundreds of innocent civilians, has had Hamas claim it was Israel behind the bombing, sparking pro-Hamas protests right around the world. But Israeli evidence corroborated by Western intelligence agencies, including US State Department and Pentagon officials, appears to point the finger at Islamic Jihad due to a misfire from one of their own rocket systems. Now, what this means, where you've got competing stories like this around an event as catastrophic as this, is the risk of further conflict escalation. And we've seen that as a result of this bombing, Arab leaders withdrew from a planned summit with US President Joe Biden, who has since now of course, returned to the United States. Joining me now to discuss this and more, the Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, Peter Jennings. I have to say, you know this well from your time in and around intelligence services, as I do. This is straight out of the Hamas sort of playbook, isn't it? Killing civilians and then trying to blame it on Israel. Given everything you've read over the last 48 hours and the corroborating evidence on the table, what do you think happened, Peter?
I think you can say with pretty much 95% certainty that this was a Hamas rocket, and that's been corroborated by Israeli intelligence, which we know is precise on these things because their Iron Dome system, which is their anti-missile system, shoots down hundreds of Hamas rockets every month. And in order to be able to do that, they need to know where they're launched, they need to know where the trajectory is, and so they will have seen it. And the Americans have their own independent intelligence gathering systems, Peter, which would make it possible for them to see it too. So this is pretty cut and dried. And in fact, I think from a media point of view, the issue here is not to sort of give equal weight to Hamas spin doctoring and what we're getting from the Americans and the Israelis, but to understand that this one at least is clear. And I think another proof of that, if you like, is the relative restraints with which Arab governments have dealt with it. Yes, they're making outrage statements, but notice that the Arab street has not yet risen, Peter, except in small numbers. And I think in some ways Arab states will distance themselves from Hamas now that they've turned themselves into the 2023 version of the Islamic State.
Explain to people, though, the tactic used in the past. We don't doubt that it may be used again in relation to this sort of sacrificial use of their own civilians, the blaming, in this case particularly, of Israel, and then this war on propaganda, how quickly that is fanned, particularly now in the online social world, to get around. It doesn't matter then if the truth comes out 24 hours down the track. It's established as a truth that this rocket was from Israel.
So Hamas's, key performance indicator is developing international outrage. And really their strategy, I think, is to try to see spontaneous uprisings, so-called in the Arab street, of protests at bad Israeli behaviour. And then the other thing I'd say, Peter, is, yes, there are 150 Israeli hostages in Gaza, about that number, but there are actually over 2 million Palestinian hostages in Gaza, and they are hostage to Hamas, which rules with an iron rod and has not the least compunction in seeing Palestinians killed in order to support this idea of building rage against Israel. Hamas, I think, wants to broaden the war, to bring in Hezbollah in Israel's north from Lebanon, maybe Syria, perhaps other countries. They want to try and turn this into a general Arab war against Israel. I think they'll fail in that, but almost everything that happens, even an accidental Hamas rocket landing on Palestinians by mistake, can be spun. And Hamas knows how to do it. They're very quick on social media, and they know they get a pretty easy run with a lot of international media as well. And so in that way, they will try and control the media space. Whereas Israel, which frankly is a more decent democratic country, went through a formal investigation of the incident to determine that it wasn't one of their weapons. And all those things take time when you're actually interested in telling the truth, not just spinning things to your own advantage.
Are you surprised by the comments today, though, from Labor MPs? I mean, we've got people on the front bench. We had some protests out the front. As I said, we're not even 2 weeks on from the tragedy in southern Israel, but there feels like a real shift in the government's rhetoric.
Yes, I think there's a couple of things which really come to mind. One is simply that the government is losing control. If every Labor frontbench member feels that it's their prerogative to now run a commentary on what's going on in the Middle East, this is going to be very problematic from the point of view of coherent Australian foreign policy. And I think what we're seeing coming out in part from last weekend is that the government has now lost a sense of central authority to keep its members in line. That's a problem. On the Israel-Palestine issue itself, I think there is, frankly, a challenge to Labor here, which is not to confuse electorate politics driven by their perception of what Australian Muslim communities might want versus the morally right thing and the strategically right thing, which is to support democratic Israel, a country with whom we have cultural, historical, people-to-people and strategic similarities. I think this is going to create an enormous management challenge for the government in the weeks to come.
Given all the focus on the Middle East, given we've been preoccupied with Ukraine, how's China in all of this? I mean, you know, if you want to be brutal, given their world domination aspirations, given they want Taiwan back in the China fold, this is a pretty opportunistic time for them, given the state of the president's grip on reality as well.
I think there is... so here we have a second test case for China to examine military conflict and to see, draw lessons from it for their own purposes. You know, more broadly, I think China has a problem, which is that it's become a friend of Iran, and Iran is really the puppet master controlling Hamas as well as Hezbollah. And it's interesting, Peter, that, you know, China now emerges with its closest friends, Iran, Russia, North Korea. These are difficult partners to control. That's a headache for Xi Jinping. On the Taiwan point, I think the real risk here is that maybe the Chinese will consider, here's an opportunity. America is spread thin, 2 carrier battle groups deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean. You know, there's potentially a window of opportunity here. And I guess the lesson for the Americans is you can't say you're going to put priority on Asia. America's a global power with global interests. It's got to be able to handle Asia, Europe, the Middle East all at the same time. And that means to say it needs to grow its military capability.
As we need to grow ours. Peter Jennings, thank you. All right, after the break, farmers concerned about the huge rollout of transmission towers, fire risk and more. Plus, Moira Deeming, she had a motion this week in the Parliament, gender affirmation, young children, involved all of those things, supported by the Victorian Liberals. We'll get to that as well. Coming up, some shocking comments from the Queensland Deputy Premier Stephen Miles, who has accused Amanda Stoker of being a right-wing, crazy, woman-hating lunatic. We'll get to that, but first let's go to Western Victoria, where farmers and landowners are up in arms about the Albanese government and the Allen government here in Victoria, up in arms about their plans to scar some of our best agricultural land with huge transmission towers to connect up new wind and solar projects to the grid. Joining me now to discuss this, a farmer from Charlton in the west of the state, Glendon Watts. Glendon, great to have your company again. When we last talked about these transmission lines, my phone line, my email lit up like a Christmas tree because people are really impacted, not just if their land is crossed, they're also concerned about their towns and communities. These towers will be put up without permission of owners. It'll be a compulsory acquisition. There'll be a whole lot of easement zones around them that will stop farmers like you from farming anywhere near the lines. But of course, there's also a big risk. The CFA, the Volunteer Fire Brigade in Victoria, says they're telling firefighters you can't do anything about a fire in and around these transmission lines. And we know in Black Saturday, we lost a lot of lives there. 5 of the big fires came from electrical lines. How concerned are people in your neck of the woods?
Absolutely, incredibly concerned, Peter. I think you've summed it up. Black Saturday, doesn't matter who you talk to, everyone knows about it because it's devastation that it created, it caused, the lives lost, the homes lost. So if the project goes ahead, it's not a question of if we have these fire risks and the impacts, it'll be a matter of when. As you've said yourself, we're not allowed to go near them I'm a CFA volunteer and all the volunteers up there, we're being told, no, you don't go near the transmission lines. At best you stay 25 metres from the easement. which, is some 100 metres. But, you tell me, for those who've been on the fire ground, you're fighting a fire on the other side of town, helping your neighbour, whatever, visibility might be 30 metres, 50 metres in a paddock or a farm that you've never been to before. So how, one, are we meant to know where that easement starts and stops? How, two, are we meant to know where it's safe and not safe to be in around these things? And then, if it is so that we have to stop and wait for the fire to move, well, what about the loss of life and the asset that's going to occur during that time of having to wait and let the fire pass the transmission line before we can continue to fight it? So it's just absolutely ludicrous. If we're not learned anything from the history of the past, the Royal Commission that took place, I just think it's just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, and it was a clear recommendation of the Royal Commission into Black Saturday that they have underground cabling because, we use so much aerial firefighting now. You have these huge towers and it's a risk to the aircraft. But the government's ignoring its own recommendations. They're going through a consultation process, I know, with your community. That hasn't gone well. I'm told people are storming out from the meetings. It's not genuine consultation in St Arnaud, I'm told. Police even had to be called. What's going on?
Yeah, look, I think you make a good point that, we're not allowed to use aircraft near the towers. And for those who aren't up with it, the risk is arcing. You've got 540 kilovolts of electricity running above your head, and then you've got thick smoke, which is a really high conductor of electricity. So aircraft, private unit, CFA unit, doesn't matter who you are, it's not going to discriminate sort of thing. So these ag pilots, they say that they leave the proximity in which the pilots are allowed to fight near the fire, backed up to their capabilities, I suppose. But their capabilities are exceptional. I've seen these guys spraying paddocks and they go under, the standard power lines that are 10 metres high, 200 k's an hour under there with their plane. So it's not that they've got limitations in their ability to fly, it's the risk they're potentially going to be impacted by. And they're a massive asset to us up there putting out fires. They're a big part of what helps us get on top of it really quickly. But with regards to the community consultation, I think consultation's a pretty poor word to explain how these events have transpired and gone. You make mention of St Arnaud. And look, St Arnaud was horribly disappointing. I wasn't there personally, but I've spoken to many who were. And TCV claimed that, there's been an assault and this sort of caper. Whereas in reality, based on the previous experience with St Arnaud, there was questions asked in the main town hall and TCV didn't have any amplifier, ability. So, there was the community members there who wanted answers and wanted to ask questions. One, they couldn't ask a question because they weren't heard. And those who did ask questions, they couldn't hear their response sort of thing. So the kerfuffle is that a young gentleman was trying to take a microphone into the hall so that ensured that the voices could be heard, and a TCV meeting with putting security on the door, and then the security guy and 3 TCV uniformed guys managed to knock this fella flat on his butt with his microphone. Other locals came to his aid, stood up, and then everyone walked peacefully into the hall. And during that time, the panel at the front of the hall vacated at a rate of knots. The presenter said, "Look, guys, we're going to give it 10 minutes." And that was the end of the conversation. TCV were gone. They never came back. They left the people of St Arnaud hanging. And not only St Arnaud, there's people who've travelled for hours to be at this meeting, to get their questions asked, to hear answers, to mitigate their concerns, the fear that they're fearing and feeling. And these guys didn't have the decency to come back into the room. They claimed that the Victoria Police said it was unsafe. That is absolute lies. I've spoken with the police who said, look, there was nothing unsafe. We never advised them of that. You guys are more than welcome to be vocal, but there was no issues with what took place in that room. So TCV continued to make accusations, continue to make claims, and you call it a consultation, but in all honesty, it's just a very vague response to try and pass it past.
All right, stay close to us on this, Glenn, and a lot of my audience are really concerned because if it's not happening to them in Victoria, they know it's on the way in New South Wales and Queensland and everywhere else. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, we will come back to that issue. It is a huge one. All right, after the break, Moira Deeming, bit of a win, I think, this week with the Liberal Party. Hope it goes all the way to putting it back in the party room, and the wonderful Nicole Flint. Welcome back. Let's bring in my panel. Independent Liberal MP in Victoria, Moira Deeming, former Liberal MP and now a bit of a sheep farmer, Nicole Flint from South Australia. Moira, I spoke to David Chrisley at the top of the show. He's the LNP leader in Queensland. He's dropped treaty support today. The New South Wales Liberal leader, Mark Speakman, He's dropped support for a treaty as well. Your mob there in Victoria, though, they are still supporting a treaty. This is John Pizzuto. You and I both know what Liberal Party members think. Any hope the Victorian Liberals, the parliamentary team, are going to do what others are doing interstate and read the room from Saturday night?
Unfortunately, Peter, I can't give you any insider information as I'm still outside that party room, but I really hope that they do listen to the membership, because it was the membership that were out on the polling booths with me campaigning for the no voice, so I can only hope.
Nicole, you're a South Australian, as I said. Your new voice of the parliament over there. Figures out today, it's extraordinary. There are stipends for people involved in it from $3,000 to $18,000, plus sitting fees of around $200 per meeting, and travel, accommodation, meal allowances, even $1,000 to get themselves a laptop. You multiply this around the country in every one of these jurisdictions where we're going down this path. It's going to take decades and cost us billions.
It certainly looks that way, Peter, and isn't it fascinating how we heard absolutely nothing from the SA Labor Party about the detail of the South Australian voice in the lead up to the federal referendum. So now we're finally seeing what their plans were and have been since, I think, March, when they suddenly introduced this and let the public know about it. And Peter, honestly, you know, the South Australian Liberal Party opposed this when the legislation was introduced, and I believe will keep fighting it. The SA Labor government, all of the state governments, the federal governments, please just get back to the closing the gap statement and start focusing on each and every issue outlined in that statement and start fixing those issues. Put all of the money towards that, and we might actually finally see some improvements for some of the most disadvantaged Aboriginal Australians.
Maura, this week I want to look at something you tried to get up in Victoria. You put forward a motion to conduct an inquiry into medicalised gender affirmation practices on young people. Shouldn't be extraordinary. A huge inquiry of this sort of similar ilk in the UK led to the shutdown of the infamous Tavistock Centre. Now, I'm pleased to say the Liberal Party supported your motion, but Labor voted it all down. Tell us who opposed you. What was their arguments?
Well, it was the usual set, the Greens, Fiona Patton's Marijuana Party, Fiona Patton's Animal Justice Party, you know, as you'd expect, that lot. I was very pleased and grateful for the Liberal Party's support. And just a big shout out to Adam Somurak and David Limbrick and Likiri Tyrrell as well for supporting me. They had no arguments against it, of course. It's just a cover-up. They know that the evidence is already in internationally, and that everyone who has any sense is already backing out of the affirmation-only model. Insurance companies are backing out, and national health services all around the world. It's a disgusting scandal, to be honest, because they're looking after their own egos instead of the safety and well-being of children.
Yeah, well, good on you for getting it up, and good on you for getting the Liberal Party on side. Let's hope it might be a bit of a thawing of the ice with John Pizzuto, but we'll see. We will see. Nicole, our good mate, former Senator Amanda Stoker, she's coming back to politics, we hope. She's running as a candidate in a state seat in Queensland. But geez, I tell you, she must threaten the Ken Dole Deputy Premier Stephen Miles, because he went after her in the chamber. He said, who would have thought the LNP would need another extreme right-wing, crazy, woman-hating lunatic? And then he goes after Amanda Stoker. Now, imagine the outrage if he said that about a woman on the left. He'd have to resign within a couple of hours of that hitting the media. So why do women on the right have to tolerate it?
Because, Peter, the left are hateful hypocrites. If a Conservative man or a Conservative media commentator had said that about a woman on the left, they would be forced to be sacked, I would say, or people would call for them to be sacked. There are such disgraceful double standards. Premier Palaszczuk needs to come out and condemn this guy, if not sack him from his position. It's unparliamentary language. I don't know how it was ever allowed, and I'm just sorry that a brilliant, super intelligent, wonderful communicator and all-round wonderful human being, Amanda Stoker, has been abused in this way. And the example that it sets the community is just wrong. It's just wrong.
I will have to leave it there. Moira and Nicole, let's hope she gets in because she'll wipe the floor with him. Is stupid as well as completely inaccurate. All right, we've got to leave it there. Here's Andrew Bolt. See you again.